Most people, when 47 motorcycles turn onto a dirt road in rural Tennessee at 7 in the morning, understand immediately that this is not their business and act accordingly. They go inside. They close the blinds. They wait for the sound to pass the way you wait for weather, not interacting with it, just enduring it until it moves on. Teresa Van did not have that option because the 47 motorcycles turned onto her dirt road and stopped at her driveway and cut their engines. Teresa was 36 years old and she had lived alone with her 3 children on the 11 acres off County Road 7 outside of Waynesboro, Tennessee, since her husband Marcus had not come home from a deployment that ended in a way nobody used plain language to describe anymore. And she had learned in the 16 months since then that the world had a specific texture when you were a woman alone with children and no buffer between you and whatever pulled into the drive. She had learned to read that texture quickly. She had gotten very good at it. She put her kids in the back bedroom and she picked up her phone and she stood behind the front door and she waited. She did not know that the man on the first bike, a broad, road-worn Hell's Angel named Walt Decker, 58 years old, sergeant at arms, 3 tours of his own, was crying before he even got off the motorcycle. She did not know that most of the men behind him were, too. She did not know what they were carrying. She was about to find out. County Road 7 runs through the low-rolling country south of Waynesboro, through land that is part old farm and part second-growth timber, and part the particular American geography of places that had a purpose once and are still working out what comes next. The road goes to dirt about 4 miles past the Baptist church, and stays dirt for another 2, before it dead ends at a gate that has been padlocked since a logging operation shut down in 2016. Teresa Van's driveway branches off that dirt stretch at a cedar post with a mailbox on it, and the driveway runs through a stand of persimmon trees to a white farmhouse that needed paint the year Marcus left, and needed it more now. Teresa had bought the place with Marcus 7 years ago because it was what they could afford, and because Marcus had said 11 acres was room enough to breathe, which he had needed. Coming back from 2 tours, more than he needed almost anything else. They had fixed the porch together. They had planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house. They had talked about chickens. Eventually, there had been a lot of things they talked about eventually. And eventually had a different meaning now. The morning the motorcycles came was the 3rd Thursday of April, and the persimmon trees along the driveway had gone full grain, and the air smelled like rain that had already passed through and left everything cleaned, and it should have been a good morning for its own plain reasons. The way April mornings sometimes are. Teresa had been up since 5:30, which was when her youngest, Owen, woke up regardless of the season, and regardless of what time anyone had gotten to bed. Owen was 4. He still asked about his father with the specific guileless frequency of a 4-year-old, who does not yet understand that some questions cause a particular kind of pain every single time they are asked. And Teresa answered him every single time because that was what you did, and she had gotten practiced enough at it that she could answer without her voice changing, which had taken her the better part of 8 months. She had gotten Nora and Jack off to school at 7:15. Nora was 10. Jack was 8. Jack had his father's eyes and the specific way of holding himself that Marcus had when he was concentrating on something. A stillness that on a grown man read as intensity, and on an 8-year-old read as a child carrying something heavier than children were supposed to carry. Teresa watched it and did not know what to do about it, and kept going, because keeping going was the full description of the job. She was at the kitchen sink at 7:40 when she heard the engines on the road. She dried her hands. She looked out the window. She saw the lead motorcycle turn off the county road onto the dirt, and then the one behind it, and then the column of them, stretching back past the persimmon trees until she couldn't count anymore. She did what any reasonable woman alone with a 4-year-old would do. She picked up Owen, told him they were going to play a quiet game in the back bedroom, and she deposited him there with his trucks and his blanket, and she closed the door, and she came back to the front of the house, and she stood behind the door with her phone in her hand and the specific cold alertness of a woman who had learned to rely on herself. The engine stopped. The silence was total. Not the silence of a place where nothing had been. The silence of a place where 47 engines had just been, and the absence of them was its own loud thing. Teresa waited. Boots on the gravel. One set. Slow. Then a knock on the door, 3 times, deliberate. The knock of someone who did not want to startle. She opened the door with the chain on. She looked through the 4-inch gap at a man she had never seen before. He was 58 years old, and he was wearing a Hells Angels cut with a Tennessee bottom rocker and patches enough to account for a long road life. And he was 6'1" and broad, and his beard was going white, and his eyes were red. Not from drink, from something else. From the kind of crying that leaves a mark for a while after. "Mrs. Van?" he said. His voice was rough, in the way voices go rough when they've been carrying something they haven't said yet. "Yes," she said. "My name is Walt Decker," he said. "We rode down from Nashville." He paused. He looked at her through the gap in the door. "We knew Marcus." Before we get to what Walt Decker told Teresa Van that April morning, if you're watching for the first time, hit subscribe and drop your city and state in the comments below. I read every one. Now, back to that doorway in Waynesboro, Tennessee, and what a man named Walt Decker had been carrying 300 miles down the road to deliver. Marcus Van had enlisted at 22. He had served 2 tours in the way that some men serve, completely without reservation, with the specific quality of a person who has decided that the thing in front of him is worth everything he has to give it. He had come home both times altered in ways that Teresa understood partially and Marcus could not fully articulate. The gap between what he'd seen and what language could hold being one of those distances that only other people who'd stood at the same edge understood. He had found that understanding the second time he came home, at a chapter meeting in Nashville that a buddy from his unit had dragged him to. Not for the bikes, but for the room, for the specific quality of being in a room full of men who had their own distances between experience and language, and who had agreed, without ceremony, not to require the language. Marcus had ridden a borrowed Harley for the first time at a chapter outing 6 weeks after that meeting. He had bought his own 3 months later. He had come home that evening with engine grease on his hands and something in his face that Teresa had not seen since before the second deployment. A kind of ease she had missed without knowing what to call its absence. That chapter had become the thing he talked about when he talked about the people who understood him. He had told Teresa about Walt Decker, the sergeant at arms, the 3 tours, the man who could sit in silence with you for 2 hours in a way that felt like the most useful thing anyone had ever done. He had told her about Cray Simmons, who had lost his left hand at Fallujah and rebuilt an engine every winter as a form of argument against what that fact could mean about a life. He had told her about the rides, not for any reason, just for the road. Just for the forward motion that resets something in the brain that nothing else reliably reset. He had been planning to bring her on a ride that spring. The spring he didn't come home from. Marcus Van died on a Thursday afternoon in December, in a country that was not his country, in a circumstance that the official paperwork described in the language official paperwork uses, which is the language of coordinates and procedures and time of incident, and which said nothing about who he was when he laughed, or the way he held stillness around him like a room you could enter, or the kitchen garden on the south side of the house, or the 11 acres he had said were room enough to breathe. He was 37 years old. Walt Decker had gotten the call the following morning from Marcus's unit contact. He had sat in his kitchen in Nashville for a long time. Then, he had called the chapter. In the 16 months since, the chapter had done the thing that chapters do when they lose a brother, which is to carry the loss in the particular distributed way that brotherhood makes possible. Not one person holding all of it, but all of them holding a portion, which makes the weight something that can be borne rather than something that simply accumulates. They had attended the service. They had sent the card and the flowers and the check that Walt had presented to Teresa at the funeral with both hands, which was the chapter's tradition for a brother's family, and which Teresa had accepted without fully being able to speak. And then, 16 months later, it was the spring Marcus had talked about. The spring he was going to bring her on a ride. Walt Decker had been awake at 3 a.m. in January, thinking about that. He had told his road captain about it over coffee. His road captain had told 2 others, and by March, the thing that had started as one man awake at 3 a.m. had become a plan, and the plan had become a date. And the date had become 47 men on 47 bikes at 6 a.m. in a parking lot in Nashville, heading south on a Thursday in April, because Marcus Van had said this was the spring he was going to do it. And they were going to do it for him. They had not called ahead. Walt had tried, twice, to figure out how to call ahead, and both times he had gotten to the part where he tried to explain what they were doing and why, and the words had not come. Because some things resist the phone call and have to be delivered by a man standing at a door. Teresa Van looked at Walt Decker through the 4-inch gap in the door. She looked at his red eyes. She looked at the parking lot full of motorcycles behind him. She looked at the 47 men standing in her drive, none of them moving. All of them waiting. The way people wait when they are carrying something that requires the other person's permission to set down. "You knew Marcus," she said. "We all did," Walt said. "He talked about you. Every week he talked about you. And the kids." His voice went rough on the word. He stopped. He looked at the doorstep. He said this spring he was going to. He stopped again. He was not going to make it through the sentence. You could see that from the doorstep. Teresa took the chain off the door. She opened it. Walt Decker looked at her for a moment. And then his face did what it had been doing since the parking lot in Nashville. Since before that, probably. Since January at 3 a.m. And he put one hand over his eyes, and he stood there on her porch and cried. Not quietly, the way men cry when they have been holding something for 16 months and the person who was supposed to be there to receive it has opened a door. Teresa Van, who had been keeping herself together for 16 months with the particular structural discipline of a person who cannot afford to come. Apart, because 4-year-olds wake up at 5:30 and 8-year-olds carry their father's eyes, and 10-year-olds write letters to their dads that. They fold and put under their pillows. Teresa Van put her hand on Walt Decker's arm. She didn't say anything. She just held on. Behind Walt, in the driveway, one by one, the others. She had not been watching the driveway. She had been looking at Walt. But when she looked past him, she saw what was happening among the 46 men who had waited while Walt knocked. And it was not what she had expected to see in her driveway or anywhere else. They were not standing at attention. They were not a formation. They were men, large, road-worn, leather-wearing men with the kind of faces that suggested the world had handed them a full load, and they had carried it. And they were broken open in the way that a specific kind of grief breaks people open, the kind that has been waiting for a place to land. 2 men near the back had their arms around each other. One man was sitting on the chrome of his bike with his hands over his face. Another had walked to the persimmon trees at the edge of the drive and was standing there alone with his back to the group. That was Cray Simmons. His left arm ended at the wrist, and his right hand was flat on the bark of the persimmon tree, and he was talking. Low, not for anyone's hearing, to the tree, or to the air, or to whatever portion of Marcus Van was still present in a spring morning in Tennessee, with the air smelling like rain already past. Owen, in the back bedroom, had apparently finished his quiet game, and had come down the hall, and was standing in the doorway behind Teresa, in his sock feet with his blanket, looking past her at the driveway. "Mama," he said, "why are those big men sad?" Teresa looked at her son. She looked at the driveway. "Because they miss someone," she said. "Same as us." Owen considered this with 4-year-old thoroughness. "Did they know Daddy?" he said. "Yes, baby," she said. "They knew Daddy." Owen looked at the men in the driveway. He looked at Walt, who had composed himself by now and was standing on the porch with his eyes still wet, looking at the small boy in sock feet with the blanket. Owen walked past his mother onto the porch. He stood in front of Walt Decker. Walt looked down at him, this 4-year-old boy with his father's dark eyes and his blanket, and whatever had been composed came apart again. "Hi," Owen said. "Hi," Walt said. "Did my daddy ride a motorcycle?" Owen said. Walt looked at Teresa. "She nodded once, he did," Walt said. "He was good at it." Owen looked at the motorcycles in the driveway. He looked at them with the focused assessment of a 4-year-old conducting a serious inquiry. "Was he fast?" Owen said. Walt made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. "He was," he said. "He was one of the fastest." Owen nodded, satisfied. He reached out and took hold of Walt Decker's hand with both of his small hands around Walt's large ones. "It's okay," Owen said. "I miss him too." The driveway went the way driveways go when 47 people in it have run out of anything to say, and the only appropriate response to what just happened is silence. Not heavy silence. The other kind. The kind that happens when something true has been said clearly and the world around it is just catching up. They stayed 6 hours. Not because anyone planned for 6 hours. Because Teresa made coffee and Walt drank it on the porch steps, and Cray Simmons came up from the persimmon trees and introduced himself with his right hand and told her about the engine he and Marcus had rebuilt together the winter before the last deployment, talking about it with the specificity of someone who needed to give someone else the details they had been carrying alone, because the man named Reg Howell, who had been in Marcus's unit before the chapter, and whose own road had been long and crooked in ways that left marks, sat at Teresa's kitchen table for 40 minutes and told her 3 stories about her husband that she had not known and would think about for years, because a man named Dooley, who barely spoke, brought in 4 cords of wood from his truck and stacked it under the south eave without asking and without expecting comment. Which was the way Dooley did most things, because Nora and Jack came home from school at 3:15 and found the drive still full of motorcycles and their mother sitting on the porch steps with Walt Decker and a man named Reg, and Jack stood at the end of the drive and looked at the bikes and looked at his mother and started walking toward her. And because Walt Decker stood up when Jack got close enough to see his face and held out his hand to an 8-year-old boy and said, "Your dad talked about you every week. He said you were the one who kept everyone organized." Jack looked at him. "I'm the oldest," Nora said, behind him. "He said you too," Walt said. Jack shook Walt's hand. He shook it the way his father had probably shown him, firmly looking at the person. Then he turned and looked at the drive. "Are those Harleys?" he said. Walt looked at Teresa. Teresa looked at her son. "You want to sit on one?" Walt said. Jack's face did the specific thing that 8-year-old faces do when the answer to a question is so obviously yes, that being asked at all is almost comical. He sat on 4 of them. Nora sat on 3. Owen sat on Walt's, both hands on the grips, and looked down the driveway with an expression of absolute authority and did not want to get off. At 4:30, Teresa stood on the porch watching her children on motorcycles in the spring afternoon light, and she was very still for a moment, not in the careful, managed way she had been still for 16 months. In the way you are still when something has shifted, when the weight that has been entirely yours has been, for a day, distributed. She had not asked for this. She had hidden her children when they pulled up. She had stood behind a door with her phone in her hand. She had not expected anything that had followed. Walt came and stood beside her on the porch. He would have loved this, she said. He would have gotten there before the kids did, Walt said. She laughed. It was real. The first one she had laughed, she would tell Nora later, that it felt like the old shape of laughing. They left as they had arrived, in formation, one by one, the engines starting down the line, the sound building from the front of the column to the back until the whole drive was full of it. Teresa and the 3 children stood on the porch. Owen still had his blanket. Walt was last. He paused at the end of the drive and looked back at the house. Teresa raised her hand. Walt raised his. Then he was gone, and the last engine note faded past the persimmon trees and down County Road 7, and the morning, it was still morning in the way that days are still mornings when enough has happened to fill a week, settled into a different kind of quiet. Owen leaned against Teresa's leg. "Mama," he said, "can we get a motorcycle?" Teresa looked at the empty drive, at the persimmon trees going green in the April light, at the tire tracks in the gravel where 47 bikes had stood and borne their weight, and then moved on. "Maybe someday," she said. "Daddy was fast," Owen said. "He was," Teresa said. "He really was." The chapter came back the following spring. And the spring after that. Not 47 every time, some years more, some less, depending on the roads and the reasons people had. But Walt Decker came every year. Reg Howell came every year. Cray Simmons came every year. And every year he went to the persimmon trees for a while, and no one disturbed him there, and then he came back. Jack learned to ride at 16. Walt taught him in the parking lot of a church in Nashville on a Saturday morning, and called Teresa afterward and told her how it went. And Teresa sat down at the kitchen table and did not speak for a moment, and then said, "Tell me everything." And Walt told her everything. The chickens happened eventually. Marcus had said eventually, and eventually, it turned out was 3 springs later, 8 hens in a coop that Dooley built without being asked on a Tuesday afternoon in June, because Dooley did things that way. They laid more eggs than the family could use, and Teresa started leaving a carton at the end of the drive for whoever passed, with a small handwritten sign on it that said, "Free, take what you need," which was what the chapter had done for her, without saying so, and which seemed like the right way to answer that. There are people in this world who get a call that rearranges everything, who are left in a house that was built for more people than it now holds, trying to fill the square footage of a life that was architected for 2, who wake up at 3 in the morning and do the math and keep going, not because the math is good, but because keeping going is the job, and the job does not close, and they are not the kind of person who closes it. And then one morning, 47 motorcycles turn on to the dirt road. And the man at the door is crying. And the reason he is crying is that he is delivering 300 miles down the road in April, the thing her husband had been saving for a season that did not come. And her 4-year-old walks out in his sock feet and takes the man's hand and says, "It's okay. I miss him too." And something that has been entirely hers, finally, just for a day, is not entirely hers anymore. If this story reached you, if you believe that some kinds of love travel further than death and find the people who need them, hit that like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And drop a comment below. Do you know a family like Teresa's? A Gold Star family? A family carrying a weight that should not be carried alone? Tell me about them. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And type Marcus in the comments if this one stayed with you.